So now that we learned a lot about navigating passing parameters, let's improve our app a little bit by going to the users component where we have a list of links in the end to single users. And let's add the router link here, pass an array as an argument. And here we want to target /users, and we already created our route, right? We have /users /id and /name. So we can use that information here in the users component. The second element here in this array therefore should be the ID. And since we have a for loop where we loop through all our users, we can easily dynamically add the ID here by accessing user ID. And the same for the name, the third element, the third segment in this path, the username, we can access username. This is how we can dynamically construct such a link. And you already saw this with the navigate method a couple of lectures earlier. So this is our router link here. Let's do the same for the servers. So here in the servers component, let's also replace the 5 here with server ID. We do have a server ID if we have a look at the service, service. You see we have IDs and names here. So we want to pass the ID, and we can now do this by dynamically fetching it here. And I will remove added though, because I not only want to load the added component here, I want to load the single server component instead. With my link added here, we need to add the fitting route. So in our app module here, we need to add another route where we have servers and then just ID to load a single server with the server component here. Right now we're always loading the added server component, so make sure to add this extra route. And of course, this will be loaded because we removed the added at the end. So we're not editing this anymore. This just loads the single component. And of course now, in this single server component, this one here, where we want to output our server data, we need to get that data we pass in the route path in the URL. We pass the ID there. We do have a server's service where we are able to get a server by ID, and we already do this in our server component here in Engion init. Right now, always for the server with the ID 1. So now use your chance to update this code to do this with the ID being passed with our route. You learned everything you need for this. Time for you to do it on your own. I will give you the chance to pause this video before we do this together. So, were you successful? Let's try it together. Of course, to get access to the route parameter, we need to inject our activated route. So we learned how to do this. Add this route property and make it of type activated route, which you need to import from @AngularRouter. And now in Engion init, you can get your ID from this activated route from the snapshot, the params object here, and then the ID, which is encoded in the URL. And now you can use this ID here to get that server. Now, if you also want to react to any changes thereafter, you need to subscribe to your params observable here, and basically do the same. You get the params here, which is of type params. Make sure to import that from @AngularRouter. And once you get this, you can get a new server whenever your params should change. So here you could then access params ID like this to update the server whenever it changes triggered on this page. So with this in place, if we reload our app and go to servers, you see we get an error here, which makes sense, because keep in mind on our servers component here, we still are always loading our single server component. And therefore we are also loading it if we don't have this ID available. So for now, I will comment this out. We will soon learn how we can nest another router in there to have some kind of child routing to load this route dynamically next to our menu here. So for now, I simply commented it out. If I now click on a server here, we still get an error. And now this can be a tricky one to spot. What's going wrong here? The issue is if we parse a parameter from our URL, it will always be a string because our whole URL is simply just text. So ID here will actually not be 1 in the case of /1. It will be a string of 1. So if we try to get a server by this ID, it will actually search a server which has an ID of 1 but a string 1. However, we use numbers here. So we simply have to make sure to convert our ID to a number, and we can do this by adding a plus in front of it. And this is perfectly fine to do with that you're making sure that the ID you're retrieving is treated as a number. Of course, you also need to make sure to do this here in your observable. So convert the params here to a number too. So with that, if we now click on servers and choose a server, you see production server here, test server in this case. And with that, this is now working as expected. We now improved our app because now we got working links here, we got working links here, and we're loading the correct server. So with that, we added a lot, but we see that our app has some limitations. It would be nice if we don't load a new page with the user or the server here, but load it next to our menu in both cases. So we somehow need some nested routing, some child routes kind of, to have a router inside a router. Let's have a closer look at this in the next lectures. We improved our app quite a bit, but the issue we have is that if we click on a server or a user, we load a brand new page. It would be nicer if we would load it next to this menu, so we need some nested routing. We can also see that in the app module, we kind of have some duplication here. All these routes here start with servers and all these routes with users. So it would be nice to nest them and to have some child routes which all start with servers then here, in this case for example. Let's add such child routes. To do this, I'll go to my servers component route, to the /servers route, and I'll add another property, children. Children takes another array of routes, so now I can simply take my two other servers routes here and add them inside of this array as children. Now servers should now be removed because that is now always prepended at the beginning anyways, so we have to make sure to get rid of it here. And now we have just ID and ID added. So this is now already better because now we group that together. It gives us more than this visual grouping here though. You notice that on the servers here, we have the servers component as the, component to be loaded still. The question now is, where will the server component be loaded then? Because that is yet another child route of our servers component. And you can see that this is an issue. If we reload our app here, everything's working. If I click on test server, now we get an error. Because now the error tells us that it cannot find an outlet to load our server component in. And indeed it can't, because the only router outlet, the only hook in our code where it should load components, is in our app component here. Now that is reserved for all our routes on the top level. So /nothing, /users, users ID name, and servers. But the child routes of servers need a separate outlet because they can't override the servers component. Instead, they should be loaded nested into this servers component. And that actually is the behavior we want. So we can quickly get there by going to the servers component HTML file. And here where we load the edit page or the app server page, well here I will simply comment out all that code and instead add a router outlet here. This now adds a new hook which will be used on all child routes of the route being loaded on the servers component, which of course is our /servers route here. So all these child routes will be loaded in this router outlet place now. So if we save this and now we let this reload, you don't see anything here, but if I click a server, it's now loaded next to the menu because this is where we added our second router outlet. And this is how you can easily add child routes. Let's do the same for the user routes now. In the app module, I'll add children here, so this property which takes an array of routes. And I only have one nested route here, but that's fine, so I will add it here. Get rid of the users at the beginning, just have then the ID and name, the two dynamic parameters, and load the user component. And now in my users component HTML file, I'll replace my app user here with another router outlet, where all the user related child routes or the one user-related child route we have, will be loaded. So if we save this, you now see we load the user next to it. And that is why it is super important to dynamically update the ID and so on, because the component wasn't exchanged. We were able to switch the loaded user while this old component, the user component, the single user component, was already loaded. And this is how you can implement child routing, nested routes, with this children property, which then holds all the nested routes.